Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Andrew Nurkin. I'm the Deputy Director for Enrichment and Civic Engagement here at the Free Library. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, one of the great fiction writers of our time, Jeffrey Eugenides. A native of Detroit, Jeffrey Eugenides is the author of 3 novels, The Virgin Suicides, Middlesex, and The Marriage Plot. He received the Pulitzer Prize in 2003 for Middlesex, which was also shortlisted for the National Book Critics Circle Award. His 2011 novel, The Marriage Plot, was also a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. That's fun to say twice. And won both the Prix Fitzgerald and the Madame Figaro Literary Prize. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and teaches creative writing at Princeton University. His new collection of short stories is Fresh Complaint. The collection is indeed fresh, though the stories span more than 20 years of Eugenides' writing. And reading through them, one sees the breadth of his talents and the consistency of his concerns. Early in the book, a character asks herself, what could be fixed? What camouflaged? What did you have to live with and ignore? In a way, these are the driving questions of the big-hearted stories in Fresh Complaint. Eugenides shows us characters in various states of distress, trying to figure out what can and can't be fixed, what can and can't be covered over, what they can and can't get away with. Please join me in welcoming back to the Free Library, Jeffrey Eugenides.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for coming. I just rocketed down 95 to be here, and sometimes not rocketing at all. Going about 2 miles an hour, so I just got here. I'm catching my breath. I'm going to read just a little bit of Fresh Complaint. There's a story, the first story in the collection. My mother died last spring, and in the last few years of her life, I was writing a story about her. I think to keep her intact in my mind, keep her alive. And I didn't want to approach the material in the usual way of a child, an adult child writing about an elderly parent. I thought I would try to write about the parts of my mother's life that I knew least well, and maybe get a different kind of story out of it. And I was visiting her maybe 5 or 10 years ago, and I saw a book that she had in her house, and it was called Two Old Women. Has anybody ever read that book? Yeah. It's a very, very popular book. There's a library here. You can take it out. And I'd never heard of the book, but it's based on an Inuit legend, and the author's name is Velma Wallace. And she grew up hearing this legend, and it's about 2 old women who get abandoned by their tribe during a time of famine. The tribe has decided to go over the mountains in search of food because the grandfathers say that there was reports of food being on the other side of the mountain. So they go over there, but the 2 old women are both too old and too slow, and they complain too much, the tribe thinks. And so they're left on their own devices. And they wander around the woods, and they run into each other, and they realize they're in the same plight, and they get to talking, and they decide that they don't really want to die out in the snow. So they combine their forces, and they learn and relearn how to hunt and fish and ice fish and to survive in the wilderness, relearning all the things that they knew as young girls. And they survive, and then at the end of the book, the tribe comes back, still starving. They haven't found any food on the other side of the mountains, and the 2 old women teach them how to survive. And the moral of the story is that the tribe never abandons its elderly people again. So this book appealed to my mother and her friend. And I guess they were reading it for years. They read it when it first came out. And then it's now in its 20th anniversary edition, 2 million copies sold. So they felt vindicated by its popularity, having signed on early to it. And my mother's friend was a lot younger than my mother. So I started writing a story that has to do with that book, what that book meant to them, and and the kind of ironic attitude they had to it. They identified with these two Inuit women, but they were living in the suburbs and in rural New Hampshire, and the things they were contending with was mainly my father, their husbands, things like that. Not really cannibals and the different things that the old women deal with in the story. Nevertheless, the book spoke to them, and through that book and that story, I saw an aspect of my mother's life that I hadn't known about at all. So it's called Complainers. Coming up the drive in the rental car, Kathy sees the sign and has to laugh. Wyndham Falls, gracious retirement living. Not exactly how Della has described it. The building comes into view next. The main entrance looks nice enough. It's big and glassy with white benches outside and an air of medical orderliness. But the garden apartments set back on the property are small and shabby. Tiny porches like animal pens. The sense, outside the curtained windows and weather-beaten doors, of lonely lives within. When she gets out of the car, the air feels 10 degrees warmer than it did outside the airport that morning in Detroit. The January sky is a nearly cloudless blue. No sign of the blizzard Clark's been warning her about, trying to persuade her to stay home and take care of him. "Why don't you go next week?" he said. "She'll keep." Kathy's halfway to the front entrance when she remembers Della's present and doubles back to the car to get it. Taking it out of her suitcase, she's pleased once again by her gift wrapping job. The paper is a thick, pulpy, unbleached kind that counterfeits birch bark. She had to go to 3 different stationery stores to find something she liked. Instead of sticking on a gaudy bow, Kathy clipped sprigs from her Christmas tree, which they were just about to put at the curb, and fashioned a garland. Now the present looks handmade and organic, like an offering in a Native American ceremony, something given not to a person, but to the earth. What's inside is completely unoriginal. It's what Kathy always gives Della, a book. But it's more than that this time, a kind of medicine. Ever since moving down to Connecticut, Della has complained that she can't read anymore. "I just don't seem to be able to stick with a book lately," is how she puts it on the phone. She doesn't say why. They both know why. One afternoon last August, during Kathy's yearly visit to Kentucky, where Della was still living at the time, Della mentioned that her doctor had been sending her for tests. It was just after 5, the sun falling behind the pine trees. To get away from the paint fumes, they were having their margaritas on the screened-in porch. "What kind of tests?" "All kinds of stupid tests," Della said, making a face. "For instance, this therapy she's been sending me to. She calls herself a therapist, but she doesn't look more than 25. She'll make me draw hands on clocks like I was in kindergarten. Or she'll show me a bunch of pictures and tell me to remember them, but then she'll start talking about other things, see, trying to distract me. Then later she'll ask me what was in the pictures." Kathy looked at Della's face in the shadowy light. At 88, Della is still a lively, pretty woman. Her white hair cut in a simple style that reminds Kathy of a powdered wig. She talks to herself sometimes or stares into space, but no more than anyone who spends so much time alone. "How did you do?" "Not too swell." The day before, driving back from the hardware store in nearby Concord, Della fretted about the shade of paint they chose. Was it bright enough? Maybe they should take it back. It didn't look as cheerful as it had on the paint sample in the store. Oh, what a waste of money. Finally, Kathy said, "Della, you're getting anxious again." That was all it took. Della's expression eased as if sprinkled with fairy dust. "I know I am," she said. "You have to tell me when I get like that." On the porch, Kathy sipped her drink and said, "I wouldn't worry about it, Della. Tests like that will make anybody nervous." A few days later, Kathy went back to Detroit. She didn't hear any more about the tests. Then in September, Della called to say that Dr. Sutton had arranged a house call and had asked Bennett, Della's oldest son, to be in attendance. "If she wants Bennett to drive on up here," Della said, "it's probably bad news." The day of the meeting, a Monday, Kathy waited for Della to call. When she finally did, her voice sounded excited, almost giddy. Kathy assumed the doctor had granted her a clean bill of health, but Della didn't mention the test results. Instead, in a mood of almost delirious happiness, she said, "Dr. Sutton couldn't get over how cute we've got my house looking. I told her what a wreck it was when I moved in and how you and I have a project every time you visit, and she couldn't believe it. She thought it was just darling." Maybe Della couldn't face the news or had already forgotten it. Either way, Kathy felt afraid for her. It was left for Bennett to get on and tell her the medical details. These he delivered in a dry, matter-of-fact tone. Bennett works for an insurance company in Hartford, calculating the probabilities of illness and death on a daily basis, and this was maybe the reason. "The doctor says my mom can't drive anymore or use the stove. She's going to put her on some medication supposed to stabilize her for a while, but basically the upshot is she can't live on her own." "I was just out there last month and your mom seemed fine," Kathy said. "She just gets anxious, that's all." There was a pause before Bennett said, "Yeah, well, anxiety's part of the whole deal." What could Kathy do from her position? She was not only out in the Midwest, but a kind of oddity or interloper in Della's life. Kathy and Della have known each other for 40 years. They met when they both worked at the College of Nursing. Kathy was 30 at the time, recently divorced. She'd moved back in with her parents so that her mother could look after Mike and John while she was at work. Della was in her 50s, a suburban mother who lived in a fancy house near the lake. She'd gone back to work not because she was desperate for money, like Kathy, but because she had nothing to do. Her two oldest boys had already left home. The youngest, Robbie, was in high school. Normally, they wouldn't have come in contact at the college. Kathy worked downstairs in the bursar's office while Della was the executive secretary to the dean. But one day in the cafeteria, Kathy overheard Della talking about Weight Watchers, raving about how easy the program was to stick to, how you didn't have to starve. Kathy had just begun to date again. Another way of putting it was she was sleeping around. In the wake of her divorce, she'd been seized by a desperation to make up for lost time. She was as reckless as a teenager, doing it with men she barely knew, in the back seats of cars or on the floors of carpeted vans, while parked on city streets outside houses where good Christian families lay peacefully sleeping. In addition to the sporadic pleasures she took from these men, Kathy was seeking some kind of self-correction, as if the men's butting and thrusting might knock some sense into her, enough to keep her from marrying anyone like her ex-husband ever again. Coming home after midnight from one of these encounters, Kathy took a shower. After getting out, she stood before the bathroom mirror, appraising herself with the same objective eye she later brought to renovating houses. What could be fixed? What camouflaged? What did you have to live with and ignore? She started going to Weight Watchers. Della drove her to the meetings. Small and pert, with frosted hair, large glasses with translucent pinkish frames, and a shiny rayon blouse, Della sat on a pillow to see over the wheel of her Cadillac. She wore corny pins in the shape of bumblebees or dachshunds and drenched herself in perfume. It was some department store brand, floral and cloying, engineered to mask a woman's natural smell rather than accentuate it like the body oils Kathy dabbed on her pressure points. She pictured Della spritzing perfume from an atomizer and then prancing around in the mist. After they'd both lost a few pounds, they splurged once a week on drinks and dinner. Della brought her calorie counter in her purse to make sure they didn't go too wild. That was how they discovered margaritas. "Hey, you know what's low-cal?" Della said. "Tequila. Only 85 calories an ounce." They tried not to think about the sugar in the mix. Della was only 5 years younger than Kathy's mom. They shared many opinions about sex and marriage, but it was somehow easier to listen to these outdated edicts coming from the mouth of someone who didn't presume ownership over your body. Also, the ways Della differed from Kathy's mother made it clear that her mom wasn't the moral arbiter she'd always been in Kathy's head, but just a personality. It turned out that Kathy and Della had a lot in common. They both liked crafts, decoupage, basket weaving, antiquing, whatever. And they loved to read. They lent library books to each other, and after a while took out the same books so they could read and discuss them simultaneously. They didn't consider themselves intellectuals, but they knew good writing from bad. Most of all, they liked a good story. They remembered the plots of books more often than their titles of the authors. Kathy avoided going to Della's house in Grosse Pointe. She didn't want to subject herself to the shag carpeting or pastel drapes or run into Della's Republican husband. She never invited Della over to her parents' house either. It was better if they met on neutral ground where no one could remind them of their incongruity. One night, 2 years after they met, Kathy took Della to a party some women friends were having. One of them had attended a talk by Krishnamurti, and everyone sat on the floor on throw pillows listening to her report. A joint started going around. Uh-oh, Kathy thought when it reached Della. But to her surprise, Della inhaled and passed the joint on. Well, if that doesn't beat all, Della said afterward. Now you got me smoking pot. Sorry, Kathy said, laughing. But did you get a buzz? No, I did not. And I'm glad I didn't. If Dick knew I was smoking marijuana, he'd hit the roof. She was smiling, though, happy to have a secret. They had others. A few years after Kathy married Clark, she got fed up and moved out, checked into a motel on 8 Mile. If Clark calls, don't tell him where I am, she told Della. And Della didn't. She just brought Kathy food every night for a week and listened to her rail until she got it out of her system. Enough, at least, to reconcile. A present? For me? Della, still full of girlish excitement, gazes wide-eyed at the package Kathy holds out to her. She is sitting in a blue armchair by the window, the only chair, in fact, in the small, cluttered studio apartment. Kathy is perched awkwardly on the nearby daybed. The room is dim because the Venetian blinds are down. It's a surprise, Kathy says, forcing a smile. She'd been under the impression from Bennett that Wyndham Falls was an assisted living facility. The website makes mention of emergency services and visiting angels. But from the brochure Kathy picked up in the lobby on her way in, she sees that Wyndham advertises itself as a 55-plus retirement community. In addition to the many elderly tenants who negotiate the corridors behind aluminum walkers, there are younger war veterans with beards, vests, and caps scooting around in electric wheelchairs. There's no nursing staff at all. It's cheaper than assisted living, and the benefits are minimal. Prepared meals in the dining room, linen service once a week, that's it. As for Della, she appears unchanged from the last time Kathy saw her in August. In preparation for the visit, she has put on a clean denim jumper and a yellow top and applied lipstick and makeup in the right places and amounts. The only difference is that Della uses a walker herself now. A week after she moved in, she slipped and hit her head on the pavement outside the entrance, knocked out cold. When she came to, a big, handsome paramedic with blue eyes was staring down at her. Della gazed up at him and asked, "Did I die and go to heaven?" At the hospital, they gave Della an MRI to check for bleeding in the brain. Then a young doctor came in to examine her for other injuries. "So there I am," Della told Kathy over the phone, 88 years old, and this young doctor is checking over every inch of me, and I mean every inch. I told him, "I don't know how much they're paying you, but it isn't enough." These displays of humor confirm what Kathy has felt all along, that a lot of Della's mental confusion is emotional in origin. Doctors love to hand out diagnoses and pills without paying attention to the human person right in front of them. As for Della, she has never named her diagnosis. Instead, she calls it my malady, or this thing I've got. One time she said, I can never remember the name for what it is I have. It's that thing you get when you're old, that thing you most don't want to have. That's what I got. Another time she said, it's not Alzheimer's, but the next one down. Kathy isn't surprised that Della represses the terminology. Dementia isn't a nice word. It sounds violent, invasive, like having a demon scooping out pieces of your brain, which, in fact, is just what it is. Now she looks at Della's walker in the corner, a hideous magenta contraption with a black leatherette seat. Boxes protrude from under the daybed. There are dishes piled in the sink of the tiny efficiency kitchen. Nothing drastic, but Della has always kept the tidiest of houses, and the disarray is troubling. Kathy's glad she brought the present. Aren't you going to open it? She asks. Della looks down at the gift as though it has just materialized in her hands. Oh, right. She turns the package over, examines its underside. Her smile is uncertain. It's as though she knows that smiling is required at this moment, but isn't sure why. Look at this gift wrapping, she says finally. It's just precious. I'm going to be careful not to tear it. Maybe I can reuse it. You can tear it, I don't mind. No, Della insists. I want to save this nice paper. Her old spotted hands work at the wrapping paper until it comes unstuck. The book falls into her lap. No recognition. That doesn't mean anything, necessarily. The publishers have put out a new edition. The original cover, with the illustration of the two women sitting cross-legged in a wigwam, has been replaced by a color photograph of snow-capped mountains and jazzier type. A second later, Della exclaims, "Oh, hey, our favorite." Not only that, Kathy says, pointing at the cover. Look, 20th anniversary edition, 2 million sold. Can you believe it? Well, we always knew it was a good book. We sure did. People should listen to us. In a softer voice, Kathy says, I thought it might get you back to reading, Della, since you know it so well. Hey, right. So to prime the pump. The last book you sent me, that Room, I've been reading that for 2 months now, and I haven't gotten further than 20 pages. That book's a little intense. It's all about someone stuck in a room. Hits a little close to home. Kathy laughs, but Della isn't entirely joking, and this gives Kathy an opportunity. Sliding off the daybed, she gesticulates at the walls, groaning, couldn't Bennett and Robbie get you a better place than this? They probably could, Della says, but they say they can't. Robbie's got alimony and child support, and as far as Bennett goes, that Joanne probably doesn't want him spending any money on me. She never liked me. Kathy sticks her head in the bathroom. It's not as bad as she expects, nothing dirty or embarrassing, but the rubberized shower curtain looks like something in an asylum. That's something they can fix right away. I've got an idea. Kathy turns back to Della. Did you bring your family photos? I sure did. I told Bennett I wasn't going anywhere without my photo albums. As it is, he made me leave all my good furniture behind so the house will sell. But you know what? So far, not a single person has even come through. If Kathy is listening, she doesn't show it. She goes to the window and yanks up the blinds. We can start by brightening things up here a little. Get some pictures on the walls. Make this place look like somewhere you live. That would be good. If this place wasn't so pitiful looking, I think I might feel better about being here. It's almost like being incarcerated. Della shakes her head. Some of the people in this place are sort of on the edge, too. They're edgy, huh? Real edgy, Della says, laughing. You have to be careful who you sit next to at lunch. Thank you very much.
Do you still have ties in Detroit?
I have emotional ties to Detroit. I have some friends in high school who live there. I have no immediate family members. With a city like Detroit, the diaspora occurred and people are all over the place. You'll find them in Hong Kong, still rooting for the Detroit Tigers. And no, I still feel very attached to Detroit. I still write about it. Even in this story, I have to get Detroit in somehow. So Kathy's from there, and there's a little bit about Detroit. And I'm going there this weekend, actually, on tour. But I don't have any natural reason to keep going back in terms of my family. Just history and wanting to keep a hand in, because I keep setting stories there, so I don't want to get too out of date. I only know about certain parts of the city. It's rather limited, and I like to go back and try to catch up with how things are changing, and a lot of things are changing in Detroit now. So
I'm from Detroit. I'm going there tomorrow to see my 89-year-old.
Is anyone here from Philadelphia? Oh, good.
To see my 89-year-old mother who lives in a retirement community, and I will say that you definitely got the part about the handsome doctors, right? Question, since I now live in Philly, we read your last novel and really enjoyed it, The Marriage Plot. We were wondering about your thoughts about Quakers, and if you have been to Quaker meetings in Philadelphia or around the area.
Yes, well, my daughter's here tonight, and we actually, was either last summer, we went down to the Quaker Meeting House, not downtown, not very far. There's actually two, but we went to the main one, I guess. Yeah. And there's a nice little one out in Princeton that I go to sometimes. And you also the person that read The Two Old Women. We've lived the same life, you and me. It's amazing. I started going to Quaker meeting with a friend of mine from college named Cynthia, who's here tonight as well. We used to go up to Moses Brown, was a Quaker school right by our college, and go there and to the Quakers. And then I started going to Quaker meetings in all different spots. The strangest one I ever went to was in Detroit, where there were so few Quakers, at least in this chapter, that it just was in someone's living room, in Livonia or something. And I drove out there and went in. It's the kind of thing you do when you're 20 years old, and did Quaker meeting there. But I've always been interested in the Quakers and impressed with them. And I was trying to find a place to extol them, and The Marriage Plot was that place. And so I tried to show how forward-thinking they were in so many of the causes in this country that have then now come to fruition. The only thing they were probably wrong about was their temperance stand, their anti-alcohol stand. Seems a little extreme, though I hold to that myself now, so I'm a very good Quaker. Which? Oh. At the time, was it bad too? Was it always bad? No, yeah, oh well, okay. All right, well, they were pretty good. I like the Quakers. So yes, I have a connection to it, and I'm glad to be in the hometown of Quakers. Yes?
As a mental health professional, I heard the mental status exam in what you were talking about, and then the depiction of in The Marriage Plot of mania, like it was like spot on. So I was actually really impressed when I was reading that. So I was wondering, is that something that was more anecdotal, or was there actual like kind of research you did? Because it was pretty spot on.
Oh, well, that's nice. That's nice to hear. There's a character in The Marriage Plot named Leonard Bankhead who has bipolar disorder. At the time the book takes place, which is the early 80s, it was manic depression. It's mostly anecdotal. Little bit of research, actually only about an afternoon of research, not too much deeper than Wikipedia. And then just imagining from the symptoms that Wikipedia described, the kinds of things that happened to you, just imagining how that would happen and dramatizing them. I think the symptoms were, for mania, becoming attached to strange and flamboyant articles of clothing, and riffing on words until language almost splits apart and becomes meaningless. So I have a long scene when Leonard is entering a manic state. He gets very attached to this hunting cap that he has, and he starts speaking rather oddly. And he stays up, it makes you stay up for days. So what I do when I write a character is I try to find some experience that I have that is in common with the character, even though it might be in a limited degree. So I haven't stayed up for a week with mania, but I have stayed up all night and partied wildly in college and at different times in my life. So I know that kind of state of mind where you think you're going to do the next thing and you just begin to take risks and all of that. If I exaggerate it to the nth degree, I got into a place where it felt like what Leonard might be experiencing. And I did talk to a few people and watch some videos of people describing mania. One interesting one that I came across was that the person got so far out of his mind that he felt he was floating through space and could see the planet Saturn approaching. He was sort of floating past it. I drew on some of that imagery in the book. But mainly you just try to act it out in a sense, as if I were playing a role of someone in a state of mania, but I do that verbally instead of on screen. That's how it feels anyway.
The first story of yours that I read was Get the Bad Guy, which I think was in the New Yorker. And by the way, the reader for the blind was fabulous. But I'm interested in if you remember sort of the genesis of that story or what led you to that story.
Yeah, it's a story called Find the Bad Guy, which is in the collection and was in the New Yorker the first time. It's a story about a man who has been kicked out of his house because of his misdeeds and is haunting the house, wanting to get back in where his children and his wife live. It's a comic story. It's a dark story, but written in a comic voice, and it's written in a Texas twang. It's a Texas, is sort of as if George W. Bush were narrating the story, and he was kicked out of his house. But as I wrote it, first I was writing it in a normal voice, and then I thought, what if he's from Texas? And then I started doing that, and it changed the language and it changed the character in my mind. He started uttering all these Texas slogans or sayings. And then as I worked on it a little bit longer, I realized, no, he's actually not from Texas. He's from Michigan. And he moved to Texas, and he's adopted this ridiculous Texas drawl because he works for a country western radio station, and he's kind of putting it on. So he became more and more fraudulent in the telling of the story and in the voice. And that, of course, accorded with the subject matter, which was a man who had been a liar and a cheater and a drinker who was finally coming to face his frailties and the errors of his ways, and what I hoped was a not entirely comic but serious transition or culmination of the story. So that's how it came to me. Usually when you write a story, you get an idea and then you make a change to it, and then that gives you another idea, and you make another change, and then you're quite far from your original impulse. And the story, in a sense, if you look at it, you'll find hints of other things you might do with the story, as though there's some sort of interplay between you and the story itself. It starts talking back to you, it feels like, a little bit when you're working on it. I don't mean that in a woo-woo mystical way, but it just does. If you think about it a lot, you get other ideas, and each thing you do changes it enough so that some other possibility presents itself. So that's how that came about.
Hi, big fan of the Virgin Suicides, and a big part of that book is just stuff and items and how they say something about our lives. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, I know you wrote it a while ago, but if you could talk a little bit about the process writing that book and how you kind of like organized all the items of like the Lisbon girls and stuff like that. And was it something you had like an inventory beforehand and planned it out, or as the story went along, did you just think of stuff and then did you have to kind of do more research on stuff?
I didn't understand did you say stealth? What did you say? Stuff and items. Oh yeah, right. Again, that story came in two waves for me. The first, I got the idea from talking to a babysitter who my nephew's babysitter, who told me that she and her sisters had all tried to commit suicide. And I was surprised, shocked by that. And I asked her why, and she said, I don't know, we were under a lot of pressure. I never saw her again, but I had this idea of that scenario. And then after a year or so, I started writing about it from the point of view of a town, town consciousness, and I adopted the first person plural voice that I use in the Virgin Suicides, a we voice. So this kind of choral narrator tries to put this mystery together, why all these sisters had committed suicide. And of course, in my version, they were all successful in doing so. But then again, I looked at the voice, and I looked how the book was going along, and the most heat was being generated when the narrator was adolescent boys who were obsessed with the girls or kind of in love with the girls. Even the boys are middle-aged, and they're kind of arrested development creatures who are still stuck in this moment of the year of the suicides. So then I narrowed the focus of the voice. I kept it a choral narrator, but I kept it male and adolescent. So I didn't at that point know. I knew that it was going to be an investigation. I knew that my narrator knew very little about what had happened, which was helpful to me as a first-time novelist, because it meant that I didn't have to know very much at all, that my ignorance in a way was a plus. This is a kind of story told by someone figuring something out. And I was quite sure I didn't know very much at the time. If I know any more now, I don't know, but I certainly didn't then. So I limited my prospects and my possibilities, and went about trying to tell this story and trying to figure out what happened. And then the stuff came along. Like what would you need if you were trying to figure out why someone committed suicide, and you didn't live in the house, and you in a way didn't even know the girls very well? You might find their diary, or you might talk to a lot of people in the town and see who had talked to them, what they'd said, and you'd start to gather evidence. And then that increased the kind of creepiness and voyeurism that was a part of the novel in its voice. So it just made a lot of sense to become forensic about their attitude toward these girls, and in that way both document their lives and also completely misunderstand them. I was watching. Have you seen the Vietnam? The 10-part Vietnam. I was interested that Roger McNamara, who ran Ford Motor Company and then took over the Department of Defense, was so into data back in the Vietnam War, and was counting how many bodies they killed and how many skirmishes they had, and he thought he could win the war by collecting data and being forensic in that way. And I was thinking, where have I heard about that? Everything's about data now, and collecting data on us through what we do on the internet, and it didn't work so well in the Vietnam War. Maybe they've gotten better at it, but there's a kind of hubris about that sort of thing, where you think just by sheer numbers and sheer accumulation of details and facts, you're going to understand something. And that was something I was playing with the Virgin Suicides as well.
In your novels, which were outstanding and received tremendous critical acclaim, why did you change and write a book of short stories as opposed to continuing with novels?
Are you working for my publisher? Because they always say, "Why are you writing short stories?" Well, I've been writing short stories all along, and I just finally accumulated about half of a book of stories, and I thought if I write some new ones and try to get better at it and see what I can do now, that I would have a book that both had new work and some older work in it. So it was just a matter of finally having enough material. I wrote the first story, Capricious Gardens, when I was in graduate school, and it was published, the first thing I ever got published, in my 20s. So going back and collecting it was a little bit like looking at your diary from years ago, both recognizing yourself and being a little bit surprised at what you find. People who read the book tell me they can see it's from a single source and a single person. To me, it feels quite various and heterogeneous. But I always knew that I was little by little going to have a collection. And I've been teaching now for 10 years at Princeton and reading lots of short stories with my students. And I also edited a book of short stories, great love stories. So the form has been at the forefront of my mind for the last many years. And I just teach and read so many short stories. It's such a difficult and entrancing form. It's, I think, the hardest thing that there is to do. I think it's harder to write a good short story than a good novel, because there's no place to make an error. So I wanted to keep trying it and playing with it, and that's what I've been doing this last couple of years. But you and my publisher will be happy that I'm now going to write a novel. So I am, well, I don't know. I've always felt suited to the novel, but I want to be a little bit ambidextrous.
Is this on? Hi. You always have a Greek-American character in every one of your books, and usually that's kind of like subtext. It's not a main point, but then Middlesex obviously focused so much on that. I was just wondering, being of Greek descent yourself, how much the Greek language and culture, or Greece itself, actually played a role in your upbringing in your life, or how much you had to investigate and do research to actually write Middlesex.
Quite a lot. I'm only half Greek. My father was born in Detroit. My mother was born in Paducah, Kentucky. So we didn't speak Greek at home because my mother didn't speak Greek. She learned a little bit of Greek to ingratiate herself to my yaya, my grandmother. But then that was it. Once they got married, there wasn't a lot of Greek learning going on. So I heard Greek all the time. On Sundays when the relatives came over, everyone spoke Greek, and it's very familiar to me. And yet it's completely meaningless at the same time. And that's probably why the Greek heritage in most of my stories is submerged in that way, because it's rather submerged in my own self. It's there. For a long time, I didn't put it in my work at all. I thought you couldn't have a character named Mitchell Grammaticus in a story. I had to name him like Mitchell Burton or something Anglo-Saxon. And then I thought, well, why? You know, I have this odd name. Why shouldn't my characters have an odd name? And then with Middlesex, I thought it wasn't my intention to write a book so much about Greeks in Greece and the immigration of Greeks, but the story I wanted to write, which was about a mutated gene that passes from one generation to the next, and a mutation that arises in a small, isolated community, it begged for me to deal with it from some angle, and the Greek angle was the one that I knew the most. My grandparents were from Asia Minor. They were surrounded by Turks, and they finally fled for their lives in the early part of the 20th century and came to America. So I didn't know much about it. I just knew the outlines of that story, and I had to do all the research into the Greekness of the book, as much as into genetics or anything else. I didn't know. I was baptized Greek Orthodox, but not brought up, so I didn't know a lot about the rituals of the wedding ceremony and the customs, folkloric things. And I found some great books on that. So I really Greeked it up, and I listened to Greek music, and I ate Greek pastries, and pretended I was a full Greek and not a half mongrel from Detroit, Michigan. Yeah.
They always ask this in the New York Times, what books do you have on your nightstand?
Right now I have a book about the Great Lakes. It's called The Death and Life of the Great Lakes. And it is one of those extremely depressing natural books. The Great Lakes, Lake Superior is the highest one, and the water flows down from Lake Superior into Lake Michigan and Huron, and all the way to Lake Erie, and then all the way out. And then what is there? There's Niagara Falls. So that was a barrier that kept out all invasive species for millennia. And then they had the great idea, we will build the Holland Tunnel and open the St. Lawrence Seaway, and we'll have boats come in to Michigan and Chicago, and it'll be like a third seacoast, which was a good idea, except those boats would come in, and they would pump out the bilge water, which would have lots of microscopic organisms in it. So the book tells you about all the different invasive species that have happened in the Great Lakes, how they've tried to kill them off, and then they created some other problem. It's unbelievable what's happened, and The State of the Lakes Now. So that's what I've been reading. On a brighter note, I've been reading a lot of the Spanish novelist Javier Marias, who is a recent passion of mine. I've just read A Heart So White, Thus Bad Begins, and The Infatuations. Javier Marias, he's a tremendous writer. And I've been reading The Anthologist by Nicholson Baker, which is a very wonderful book about a poet who his name is Paul Chowder, and he has to write an introduction to a poetry anthology, and he can't do it. He's blocked, and instead of writing that, he writes this book. So that's what's on my table right now.
Hi.
Hi.
So in the past decade and several years, obviously the way that people think about gender and sexuality and sex has changed quite a bit. Do you think any of that would influence, if you were writing Middlesex now, the way that you would write it, or the way that the characters' experiences would occur?
No, I wouldn't write it now, because it would be like, oh, well, another book like that. Even in 2002, when I wrote it, I had to explain the concept of gender identity to audiences. People hadn't thought that gender identity could ever be anything other than a biological determination or fact. So now I don't think I would have to do that, but it would decrease my interest in writing about it. It's only 15 years ago, but you're right. The speed at which things have changed is astonishing. So I don't think I would. I approach that book as I approach any character. I'm just writing about one person and one experience, not something representative. So no matter what would change, I wouldn't alter what I had done. I did it at the time I could do it, and with what I knew. So I wouldn't. But I wouldn't be interested in writing it now.
I was interested to hear about how you seem to take something that you hear about or something that's factual and then create around it, imagine things and create a story out of it. And forgive me for turning that into kind of a maudlin question, but we're all grappling with the horror of what happened in Las Vegas. And I'm wondering whether your imagination or how you take a fact and build upon it, create a story about it, has caused you to have any thoughts about how this person could have done what he did.
It's fun. I had a reading the other day in Washington the night the shooting happened, and I think I was reading from the story I read tonight, and I came back to my hotel room and turned on the CNN and saw everyone talking about it, and I had this feeling that I often have, like, look at how crazy the world is. Look what's going on around me. How am I supposed to respond to that? Does it invalidate this nice little quiet story about my mother and her friend? Or does it not? And I usually think it doesn't. I continue to live my life and derive meaning outside of current events, and I find it dangerous sometimes to deal with them too immediately and too directly, because number one, you're going to enter into competition with 100 million narratives about what's going on. I'm not really answering your question, but I will. So I get worried about trying to deal with what's happening in politics or in society right at the moment. I think novels are very good at digesting things and thinking about them and ruminating about them. So I could write about 1970s now and feel like I would be able to say something about it more than what happened last week. I do sometimes feel that novelists are as good as the political pundits to try to figure out why people are doing what they're doing, but they never ask. But in this case, from what I've seen, the little I know, I'm as baffled as anybody else is, and a little bit disturbed by the need to know. Like, I don't really want to know what was this one guy's problem that caused him to do it. I just wish that he didn't have the means to do it, and because there's always going to be a lot of people like that, and even if we figure it out in his one case, you know, it wouldn't really help. And he seems like the Unabomber is actually an interesting person psychologically, and I could think about him for a long time. What I know a little bit about Paddock, he doesn't have a similar attraction to me in terms of trying to figure out what he is. He seems almost like a strange non-entity in a way, but we don't know yet, really.
Yeah. Do you ever like face challenges or get worried writing characters that are so different from you?
Yes, of course. I feel there's an obligation as a writer not to just write about myself, and also I don't want to do it. It's not very interesting, and I'm not a very interesting character. So I try to write about other people, but then you have to feel that you're able to do it accurately. And I don't want to curtail anyone's artistic freedom or, you know, imaginative freedom in where they go. But I do have a red light that goes off in my head when I feel I just don't understand a character. I don't have the experiences or the knowledge to go into a character's head, and then I won't be able to write about that character. But usually there's something that will allow me to at least try to do it. The last story in this collection is about a British physicist who's middle-aged and an American girl of Indian descent who's 16, 17. So they're wildly divergent people, and I had a trepidation about writing from the young girl's point of view and also from the physicist's point of view, though I did have him speak about gravitational waves in the story, and they just won the Nobel Prize on Monday. The science I used, I was quite pleased that I had picked a good experiment. But I was worried about both of those, and because I knew it was a short story, I knew that I only needed a certain amount of knowledge about their lives to do it. If I were writing a whole novel from their heads, it would have been even harder. So I do think about it, but I never let it spook me off too much so that I won't do it. The fun and the joy of it is really not being yourself. And I was just that's all I'll say on that. Well, thank you so much for coming. I enjoyed it. Thank you.